Hello and welcome to iCatholic. I'm Wendy Grace. Well, the Oireachtas committee that was tasked with looking at the issue of assisted suicide and euthanasia spent 9 months hearing from various experts from all over the world presenting their case for or against its introduction. I have to say, coming at this from a journalist perspective and having read all of the transcripts or indeed watched some of the presentations, I do find it hard to believe that the recommendation from the committee was to introduce assisted suicide and euthanasia, especially given the evidence and indeed the horror stories presented from many other countries, and the fact that the overwhelming majority of medical professionals that are dealing with dying and death in this country were opposed to it. People like the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland, representing over 15,000 doctors, geriatricians, palliative care doctors, the College of Psychiatry, all were opposed to this based on their clinical expertise and experience. And yet, Irish politicians are still saying that this should be introduced here in Ireland. But what about the lived experience of other countries? Well, joined with me to discuss this and indeed his work, I have Alex Schadenberg, who is the Executive Director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. Alex, thanks for being with us today. How did you feel, or were you surprised about the Oireachtas committee members here in Ireland recommending the introduction of euthanasia and assisted suicide?
Well, I'm not Irish, but as you know, but I think that your committee was probably stacked with pro-euthanasia people because it didn't make a lot of sense. I know of quite a few experts from Canada, palliative care experts and other ethicists experts from Canada, who told the committee in Ireland the stories and what's happening in Canada, like real life stories, not just, something that you could happen. These were real life stories of people. And yet that was not taken serious enough for them to realize this was a bad idea. Like, for instance, recently we have the story of the 27-year-old young woman in Calgary who has autism, who's been approved for euthanasia. And her dad has been challenging this in the courts because he doesn't understand how his daughter could have been approved to be killed. He just can't understand this. She's not sick. She is depressed. Yes, that's true. She's depressed. But there's no reason in any way. Now, I don't believe there's ever a reason to kill her, but you know what I'm getting to. There's just no reason for it, yet this is what's happening in our country. And you have these similar stories going on in the Netherlands, the recent stories of the 28-year-old woman who's been approved for euthanasia in the Netherlands, and that's going to happen in early May. Once again, an autistic woman, healthy, physically healthy, but has been approved to be killed. And you just say, well, we're not going to do that in Ireland. Well, they might say that in the beginning, but that's what we said in Canada too. They said, the government said over and over again, we're not going to do those things in Canada as what's happening in the Netherlands and Belgium, but we've surpassed them. That's the reality. So this concept of killing and we can have a little bit of killing and just a little bit to deal with suffering is actually not true. It's not possible.
Well, that was one of the points that was made by various, especially palliative care experts in particular, that when you introduce this idea of consensual killing into the healthcare space, then it changes how we view death, how we view dying, how we view disability, and as we can see now in Canada, how we view even things like autism and indeed mental health. Yeah. And people might realize, so at the time when this issue was first kind of put into the public psyche here in Ireland, it was a bill that was tabled around 10 years ago. And in that time, Canada introduced legislation in a similar guise to what's being proposed here in Ireland, so-called restrictive, and that has unravelled very, very quickly. And it accounts for, tell me a little bit about that, Alex, just in terms of the number of deaths it accounts for and how, I mean, even hearing things like how doctors are told to even present MAID, as it's called, medical assistance in dying, to particular patients. How much has it changed the culture and what sort of an impact has it had overall?
The things have massively shifted in Canada. So at first, the law had a terminal illness type requirement in it. But similar to all this legislation, you can't really define that. Like, we defined terminal illness in a way that was called that your natural death was reasonably foreseeable, which really wasn't a terminal illness definition at all. Nonetheless, in 2021, our government struck that down. They removed that from the law. And so what was remaining in the law, that if you didn't have to be terminally ill, then what was required in the law was you needed to have an irremediable medical condition. Now, the law does say you have to be suffering, which is the same thing that the Irish proposal is talking about. But the problem with this concept of suffering is I can't tell you that you're not suffering when you tell me you are.
Yeah, like it's a subjective. Your idea or experience of suffering could be totally different to mine.
But even then, if you tell a physician you're suffering, how does your physician know that you're actually? It's not possible. So I mentioned earlier about the case of the 27-year-old girl in Calgary who's autistic. She was turned down the first time for euthanasia, and then she realized her problem was she didn't tell them she was suffering. So when she went back to ask the second time, she insisted that she's suffering. You can't tell her she's not suffering because none of us are inside her body. We don't know what she's experiencing. Her dad says, but she lives at home. She's totally fine. She wants to die. But this is the kind of thing. We've now had euthanasia. So we've been debating euthanasia for mental illness since 2021. That's been a big issue in Canada. We're now debating euthanasia for children, euthanasia by advance directive, euthanasia for people with Alzheimer's, dementia, because they're saying, well, these people are suffering. If it's all about suffering, how can you ever control it? We've had euthanasia for poverty, euthanasia for homelessness, and we've had all these stories of people having difficulty getting medical treatment in our universal healthcare system who have died by euthanasia, not because they wanted to, but because they were in such a long lineup, they were in such a long queue for treatment that in the end, euthanasia became the option for them. And this is the kind of thing you get. You get the whole shift. It starts out as a concept of, this will be for that last resort. And a lot of people will say, well, I don't want to suffer. So they'll think, well, maybe that's okay. But you see, the problem is you can't leave it to a last resort because then it becomes the concept of discrimination gets brought into the debate. And the argument then becomes, well, how come this person can have it, but this person can't? Well, you can't justify that once you've crossed the line and said it's okay to kill. And this became the problem. Everything became now the opening of the debate because you crossed the line, you said it was okay to kill. Why can't you then kill children? Why can't you kill people who aren't terminally ill? Why not people with disabilities? And why not this autistic girl? It's a hard thing to debate once it's okay to kill.
One of the things and pieces of evidence that was presented, Alex, was, the fact that even with what's being presented as narrow parameters, which of course, as you've detailed, they are anything but, that, the fact that it creates categories of people. In other words, it says, if you fall into this particular category and have this neurodegenerative disease, or you are told you've X amount of time to live, well, then all of a sudden your value is less than. And it's no surprise then that disability rights groups all over the world are largely opposed to euthanasia and assisted suicide. How much are we not joining the dots here on seeing just the devaluing of the person, but also the fact that if I'm in that situation and I fall into one of those categories, the doctor said it's the choice not to die this way. I have to tick that box or not tick that box, right? And psychologically, therefore, it's understandable that in the majority of countries where this is legal, one of the key driving forces is not that I want to alleviate suffering, but I don't want to be a burden to other people. So not only does it affect the culture, but it affects our understanding of ourself and our innate value.
That's exactly it. It totally affects the value we have upon ourselves, but also the attitude towards the individual when they're going through difficulty. So I'll just be straight with you. I've had a lot of conversations with people who've been approved for or were seeking, we call it MAID in Canada, it's euthanasia. They call it MAID just so we can feel better about it, medical aid in dying. Anyway, it's all killing. That's what it is. I'm opposed to killing. So anyway, I've had quite a few conversations with people who were either seeking it or were approved for it. And even people with significant health problems, when you talk to them and you actually ask them, why do they actually want someone to kill them? Because that's what they're asking for. Their response is always, well, I feel my life lacks meaning. My life lacks purpose. I don't know why I'm continuing to live. I'm lonely. I have nobody in my life. I don't want to be a burden on my children. This is the kind of thing you hear. And, they sell it to us. So they sell legalization to us under this concept of suffering. They say, well, look, do you want to suffer? Well, I don't want to suffer. Nothing personal. I don't want to suffer. I'm assuming you don't want to suffer. But it's not actually, believe it or not, when you look at the data, it's not actually about suffering. There's very few people that applies to. It mainly applies to people who are asking for a death because they might have fear of suffering, or they're going through this existential angst, these questions around purpose, meaning, sometimes they just want to get it done. So now it's offered as an option. They just want to get that. They want to come to the end quickly because they're afraid of what might be. These are all different reasons that is sold to us for. And this is the reality. The euthanasia for poverty, though, has really been a problem in our country. Poverty, homelessness. And the reason is that the law, when we took out the terminal illness requirement, it meant that basically almost anybody with a disability qualifies. Almost anybody with a disability qualifies. Well, a lot of people with disabilities are living in poverty. A lot of them are homeless. A lot of them are having a very hard time getting medical treatment. So they're getting approved for being killed because they have this irremediable medical condition, this disability. They're actually asking for it because they say, I can't live like this any longer. So we have social conditions leading to killing. It's ridiculous.
Just finally to ask you, Alex, we're at a point here in Ireland where this is a recommendation that has been made by a committee. It's not legislation. And there's people watching, listening, saying, this really concerns me. A lot of what you're saying I didn't really hear, because sadly here in Ireland, very little of the evidence presented against it was actually reported on in the media. There was very little intellectual interrogation of some of these really important issues. And it just kind of focused on some of the difficult stories of kind of individual cases. So what would you say to people? How should we, if we're concerned about it, what can we do about it?
Well, here's your difficulty. The difficulty is you have to convince your elected representatives just to say no to this. One of the best ways to fight these things when you have a government that leans towards legalization, meaning you have a government where the members seem to already have accepted this concept, is to fight against the language of the legislation, because often the language of the legislation has more meaning than the concept itself. Because the average person in Ireland who supports this, they're only going to be supporting this usually based on terminally ill people who are suffering. Those are the terminal adults who are suffering. That's how that's usually that support base. But these laws are much wider than that. They're far more wider than that. We have to defeat these things, but we have to wake up the people. It's never a good idea to pass a law that gives doctors or nurses or some group of people in your culture the right and law to kill you. And that's what you're doing with these laws. That's what they're about. Like, if you actually read the legislation, you read Canada's law, you would say, that's a homicide law. And I'd say, yes, it is. It's a murder law. In fact, how Canada legalized euthanasia is we created an exception in the criminal code to homicide. It's the same thing as in the Netherlands. There's an exception to murder in the criminal code. That doesn't seem very good, actually. Like, really think about it. The final thing that I always say to people is don't follow our lead. Don't follow Canada's lead. We've gone down the tube so quickly, it's ridiculous. And it's so hard now to turn around, even when the people recognize that this is a serious problem. This is serious what's going on. Yet at the same time, the other side then will present another story. So yes, people will say, I don't like the idea of euthanasia for mental illness alone. That's a bad idea. But then the other side, the euthanasia lobby, they come up with some story of someone who's suffering so greatly from mental illness, and people are saying, oh, I wouldn't want to suffer like that. Well, we all know that people are suffering from mental illness. We all know that people have physical issues, but we should be caring for people. We shouldn't be killing them. And once we start killing them, there is no further line in the sand. Like, the line in the sand is I can either kill you or I can't. That's the line in the sand. Outside of that, there isn't another line in the sand. Once you legalize, what are you doing? You're then going to only debate who can do the killing and for what reason. That becomes the new debate. What seems ridiculous previous to legalization, once legalized, that seems reasonable because you've already crossed the line. The goalpost has moved.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for joining us on iCatholic today and shedding more light on this a really important issue of euthanasia and assisted suicide. And we really appreciate your time. The best thing that you can do now, if you're concerned about some of the issues, we have local elections coming up, a general election probably within the next year. You need to tell your local representatives that it's something that concerns you and you want them to stand up against it. Yeah. Thanks for being with us.
Elections have consequences. Absolutely.
Actions have consequences indeed. Thanks for being with us on iCatholic today.